Welcome, happy Friday, everyone, and welcome to the weekly episode. Friday episode. Maybe I should not say Friday. I don't know. Maybe. Anyway, welcome to this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. My name is Edwin Sarmiento, and welcome. If this is the first time you're joining in, welcome. I talk about some of the topics that affect SQL Server DBAs as they deal with SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery solutions. And in most cases, because Microsoft has been talking about all of these always on availability groups, they pertain to that platform. Although Microsoft has a ton of high availability solutions for the SQL Server platform. But like I said, if you are a SQL Server DBA or maybe a sysadmin and you were voluntold, I kind of use the elbow nudge out there because sometimes you've been voluntold to do stuff that is completely outside of your job responsibilities or job scope. But then you're the person that's closest to the database server, like you're sitting right next to it. Next thing you know, you need to take care of it. And so if you're a SQL Server DBA or a sysadmin or just somebody who was given the responsibility to take care of a SQL Server high availability solution, this is for you. And the topic that I want to talk about today, if I can use my, there we go, my stylus to reach out from my phone, is how to deal with a black box even when you don't have access. And I kind of look at availability groups or SQL Server high availability solution much like a black box. And I'll take this definition off of Wikipedia of what a black box is. It's a closed system where you don't have any internal knowledge of what's going on inside it. And because your SQL Server databases could be running on some of these black boxes, sometimes you don't even know what's going on. I'll give you a very simple example. Let's say that your always on availability groups or your failover clustered instances are running on a virtual machine, but then somebody else is taking care of the virtual machine. Maybe your VM admins are taking care of the underlying VM host, and you have no clue at all how the VM was configured, how the underlying VM host is configured. And next thing you know, you keep getting these outages after outages, but because you do not have access to that quote unquote black box, you're stuck, right? That's just one example. Especially in large organizations where you have segregation of duties because of security and compliance, and in some cases where you're not given full permissions. I hope you are not given domain admin privileges across the network, because that is a complete security nightmare. I don't know why people do it, but because of segregation of duties, security and compliance requirements, you have these silos. The sysadmins will take care of the operating system. Sometimes they also take care of the Windows Server failover cluster. You have your networking people taking care of the network. You have your VM admins taking care of the underlying VM host, whether that's VMware or Hyper-V or Zen or Citrix. And they'll just give you a VM for you to install either the operating system plus SQL Server and then configure always on availability groups. The challenge there is really the fact that other than not having access to those black boxes, you don't know what is going on. How was it configured? Were they following certain best practices to allow always on availability groups or available clustered instances to work the way they're designed? So this is the bigger challenge for, again, the DBA sysadmins, because for one, if you don't know how to deal with black boxes, and like I said, I don't want you to just ask for permission, start poking around, because there's a reason why you have segregation of duties, and there's also a reason why you have specialization, right? But if you're not, if you cannot deal with this, if you don't know how to deal with your black box, especially if your job is on the line, there are certain consequences. For one, it gets so frustrating when you get blamed for something. I don't know about you, but I've worked with several environments and several customers where the DBAs are getting blamed. We joke around the fact that we have our definition of what DBA stands for, and it's the default blame acceptor. So long as something happened, it's the database problem, and the DBAs and the databases get blamed for it, right? And it's frustrating because there's finger pointing, there's blaming, and sometimes you don't even know what's going on, but then you get blamed for it. I was just talking to a previous client the other day where they said, well, we want you to do an evaluation of the database because the performance of the application is slow. And they immediately assume that it is the database, right? And this is a side effect. If you're not clear and you don't know how to deal with these black boxes, you get to be blamed. You get to be, I don't want to say everybody points at you. There's finger pointing. In addition to that, if you don't have access to these black boxes, it takes longer to accomplish a simple task. Just a simple task, a simple tweak in the configuration setting, a simple setup may take longer because number one, you don't have permission. Number two, you don't know who to talk to. Number three, you don't know how to make those changes. So that will definitely take a very simple task much longer. And you know how it is, especially when you have ticketing systems and you submit a request. You would have the begin time or the start time and the end time. And sometimes when you have these annual performance reviews, you'll start looking at all of the things that you've accomplished in the past. And this reflects as a bad performance on your part. When in reality, you don't even have access to the system, but because the ticket was assigned to you, and it has something to do with stuff outside of SQL Server, part of that becomes, okay, not only are you going to get the blame for a task that will take longer, but it also reflects as something of bad performance. So by the time that you have your annual performance review, you kind of like, okay, why am I not getting the raise, or why am I not getting promoted? It's because of this, right? And it becomes really frustrating. And the more tasks that get delayed, the more they pile up. Next thing you know, you're working long hours. And this is a side effect of working with a SQL Server high availability solution that deals with or that runs on a black box. And there are so many of these black boxes. Again, when I started talking about availability groups, I started telling you that your job is now dependent on the things that you're not even aware are dependent on, which means your effectiveness, your efficiency, your productivity is now dependent on the things outside the scope of what SQL Server can control. And that's why you really need to understand what these are. And I wanted to share with you 4 things that I've learned in both my consulting practice and when I was still working as a data center engineer on how to deal with these black boxes even when you don't have access. Make sure you have your pen and paper ready. Take notes because you are going to need this to make sure that you know how to deal with them. Plus, knowing how you can share these with your other colleagues or teammates from other teams in order for them to allow you to do your job easier. And not just even that, even for troubleshooting purposes. 4 things that you can do to start dealing with a black box. Your SQL Server availability groups or your failover cluster instances are dependent on when you don't have access. The first one, and this is very crucial. The first one is you need to understand the black box. Understand it. If it's the failover cluster and you don't have any access to the failover cluster, recognize that SQL Server sits on top of a failover cluster in order to provide high availability. If that's the VM host, understand that the SQL Server VM is sitting on a VM host, and you need to understand the VM host. I kind of use the analogy of when you're moving to a new city. Maybe you accepted the job at a new place, and you're moving into that city. You're moving into a new home, or maybe in a new country. The one thing that you have to learn is understand the community. When we moved to Canada more than a decade ago, one of the first things that I started doing as we were getting ready was, where am I going to be living? This is a city. It's the capital of Canada. What are the things that I need to learn? Oh, and by the way, we have to deal with winter. And so understanding all these bits and pieces allowed us to prepare ahead of time, that when we finally moved there, we know how to settle down. We needed to know where the schools are. We needed to know where the groceries are. I needed to know how cold it gets so that I know which clothes to bring. Schools, how far away are the schools from where I live? How far away is the place that I'm going to be living in from my work office? And this was way back when I still had to go to the office. And it proved to be very important, because I think about 3 or 4 months after we moved there was a massive public transport strike, meaning you can't take the bus, you can't take any of the public transport. And because I understood how far away I am from the workplace, I knew how to move around. I knew how to get around, even with no public transport available. And this is key, though. Remember when I said earlier that availability groups or failover clustered instances, or any SQL Server high availability solution for that matter, depends so much on things outside of SQL Server. Failover clustering is what makes always on availability groups and failover clustered instances highly available. But then, if your scope falls within the boundaries of SQL Server, and you're not aware of what is going on with a failover cluster, chances are, if something went wrong, well, you got to be clueless, and you get blamed for it. I couldn't count the number of times when the DBA gets blamed for something, like an outage, for instance. I remember a client that I worked with a couple of years ago, where every 8 p.m., their entire application stack, one that relies on available groups, will be down for like 30 to 45 minutes. It's a complete outage every 8 p.m. And I'm kind of curious, why 8 p.m.? What is going on at 8 p.m.? And when they started describing the environment, they have virtual machines running SQL Server with failover clustering, and this hosts their SQL Server databases inside an availability group. Their application connects to this, and every 8 p.m., the VM admins start doing their typical tasks, which, if you're not familiar with that, they do their snapshots, and sometimes it takes about 30 minutes, sometimes it takes 45 minutes, and the VM admins are taking the entire host's backup. They're doing snapshots, and that's why it takes 30 to 4 or 5 minutes for the entire thing to be unavailable, and then it comes back online. And here's the, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, the DBAs are not aware of this. However, when the entire application goes down, they realize that it is the database that's not working fine. And so the DBAs start working on this. They realize, hey, we can't really do anything about it, but we are getting the blame. This is very important. And I'm not saying you need to master the technology or you need to master the black box. You don't have to. You just need to understand what the black box is, what it does, and how it impacts your SQL Server databases, your high availability solutions. Because by knowing you now have something to communicate to the stakeholders, the other members of the team, or the end users. The good thing about this is that uh, uh, 8 p.m. was after business hours, and so nobody was using the system after business hours, and so they were okay with a 30-minute to 45-minute outage. But again, so much for being highly available. You're not supposed to have any outages if you have a high, or if you have outages, they're not supposed to take 30 to 45 minutes. It should be a couple of seconds, maybe a couple of minutes, but not 30 to 45 minutes. But until they recognize that what the VM admins were doing were contributing to the outage. In fact, they were the one causing the outage. They knew how to communicate that first to the VM admins. They were telling the VM admins, don't include our VMs or the SQL Server VMs on your VM snapshot. I don't know why it's taking them that long. But they communicated to the VM admins, don't include our SQL Server VMs on your regular instance, like backups or snapshots like that. Understanding does not require mastery. All you need to do is understand how it works. And you know how it is with technical professionals. We get pulled into this because we're curious. We want to understand how it works. Next thing you know, you're reading about how VMware, if we're talking about VMware, you're reading about how VMware works. You're reading about how Windows Server Failover Clustering works. You're reading a lot of these things, and you can't really use what you've learned because you don't have access, right? But by understanding how these things work, you know who to talk to, you know how to communicate with them, which leads me to the next thing, right? The second thing that you need to do in order to deal with a black box, even when you don't have access, is to communicate with the team that is in charge of the black box. And when I say communicate, I don't mean send a text message or send an IM or send an email. What's interesting is we technology created the modern means of communication. Yet, technical people like us would rather send an email or send a message on a Slack channel or send an IM instead of picking up the phone or walking to someone else's cubicle. Now that everybody's going back to the office, walking to someone else's cubicle and have that conversation. And I can totally understand how we would rather do that because it's how we have gotten used to. However, if we're not communicating with the teams that are responsible for these black boxes, it creates a ton of miscommunication. You know how it is. Somebody would open a ticket, they provide the details, but because we speak different languages, we have different expressions. In fact, even different teams will have their own internal culture, if you want to look at it that way. They will have different ways of communicating things. The miscommunication becomes a way for you to cause a lot more confusion. I remember when I started working with availability groups, and you know how it is when you create a listener name. If I talk to the sysadmins or the Active Directory guys and ask them, let's say, for organizations where you have tight security policies, I could tell them, can you create create a listener name for me? Of course, the Active Directory guys don't have any clue about what it is that you're asking them to do. I mean, what's a listener name? They don't know that, right? In in the same way, if you talk to the failover clustering guys and say they're the ones responsible for the underlying operating system in a failover cluster, and if you ask them, hey, do you mind tweaking the session timeout value? Well, your understanding of session timeout value might not be the same as what your failover cluster team understands about it. It's one of the reasons why I use specific terminologies for different teams so that we are on the same page of what we really are talking about. It's just like speaking the same language. A lot of you watching this and listening to this understand English. If I start speaking in a totally different language, you may not understand what I'm saying, even though we may be referring to the same thing. And again, it's just the nature of the language we speak. And this is the reason why when I'm talking to Active Directory guys, I refer to things that are specific to Active Directory. For instance, cluster name object or virtual computer object. The listener name is simply a virtual computer object. And I don't talk to them in terms of, hey, can you create an always on available group listener name? Because they don't know that. That's a SQL Server specific term. Whereas if I talk to them in terms of something that they understand, like for instance, Active Directory virtual computer object, they can associate that. Even though we're talking about the same thing, it's the exact same thing. They use different terms for it versus what SQL Server uses in terms of the same jargon terms. And this is very, very important because, again, we have gotten used to communicating via instant messaging, via tickets, via emails, that we don't get to communicate properly in a way that both teams understand, the DBA teams versus the sysadmin teams, or the sysadmin teams versus the networking teams. And here's the thing. Communication is something that, because of how we've created these barriers to communication, sometimes it becomes the source of confusion. I like how the Microsoft documentation would come up with so many different things, so many different names, and they're all the exact same thing. Like I said in the beginning or earlier, a listener name is an Active Directory virtual computer object. It's a DNS record. And so when you start to look at these are three different things when you simply listen to the terms and the jargons, but they all mean the exact same thing. Well, again, there could be some debates around what an Active Directory virtual computer object is versus a DNS entry is. But again, at the end of the day, you have to speak their language. You have to communicate with the teams responsible for those black boxes. And in this is really, really important. Know how to ask questions. Sometimes it becomes challenging for us to ask questions, especially in the context of working in tech, because most of the time you don't want to feel stupid. I hear this a lot, especially when somebody would ask a question during a presentation, and sometimes the speaker would say, "Oh, that's a stupid question." Don't be afraid to ask questions, and don't assume what you're asking for is a stupid question. I don't know anything, or not, I don't know everything, and so if I don't know something, I would ask, because I would rather ask questions than assume. The thing about this is, again, when you're dealing with a black box, you assume instead of ask. And that's part of communicating. Learn not just the black box, understand black box, but there are limits to your understanding. So better ask the people who are doing this day in and day out. Ask your Active Directory guys. What are they doing on a daily basis? This is part of communicating with those teams. This is part of understanding not just the black box, but also the people managing those black boxes, right? There should be a continuous flow of information between teams as far as managing a high availability solution is concerned. And I keep telling people all the time, a high availability solution or managing a high availability solution is a team sport. You can't do this on your own. And even if you can, you don't want to be on call 24/7, 7 days a week. for 365 days a year, it is going to burn you out. That's why it's important for you to communicate with the other members of the team managing those black boxes. That's the second one. I know it took longer than what I wanted to share, but it is really important. Communication really does matter in the context of different teams managing those different black boxes. The third thing, and like I said, make sure that you're taking notes. The third thing is to set and manage expectations. Setting and managing expectations. It's a really good principle, but I've learned this from one of my previous managers way back when I was still working as an operational DBA. IT is really all about setting and managing expectations. And the reason for this is, remember earlier when I said that you may be blamed for something that you didn't do? And that's because there are assumptions rather than setting expectations. When a database goes offline, it's the DBA who needs to be taking care of that. It's an assumption because in the early stages of the life cycle of the database or the application in general, something happened to the database, it's just a DBA's responsibility. Now that your databases are in a high availability solution or high availability platform that was not communicated properly, that now the database is now sitting on a VM, and therefore the VM guys need to be in charge of the VM and not the DBAs. Now that the databases are sitting on a failover cluster, it's the system guys, sysadmins that need to be responsible for the failover cluster, the operating system. But because that's not communicated, which goes back to my previous point, because that's not communicated properly, the expectation still remains, oh, that's the DBA's responsibility. And unless you set clear expectations, people will always, or stakeholders or other people within the organization would still expect you to do the things you've done in the past. And setting and managing expectations is also part of improving your operational processes. I remember one of the things that I keep hearing from the different clients that I've worked with, different customers, is that, wait, the Windows sysadmins, they're the ones responsible for the operating system. They're the ones responsible for the failover cluster. When they are performing maintenance on either the operating system or the physical or virtual machine, they don't tell the DBAs. And when that happens, they may do something that would impact the availability of the databases. Again, your failover cluster instances, your availability groups, they're sitting on a failover cluster. If the sysadmins that are taking care of the operating system have no clue at all what the impact of what they're doing is to your database, they're just going to continue doing it and not have any not have any concern at all. It's not that they intentionally did not care. It's that it's part of human behavior. When you are doing the same thing over and over and over again, the next thing you know is you default to your old behavior. And I remember this vividly a couple of years ago working with a client where part of installing patches and cumulative updates or security updates, the Windows sysadmins will take care of that. And so the DBAs are like, okay, we don't have permission to do that. It's the sysadmins who will be doing that. However, whenever the Windows sysadmins would do this, they still follow the best practice, install the patches on the secondary, reboot, and then install the patches on the primary, which would trigger a failover. And they've done it for so long that for them, it's normal. We're just installing patches without realizing that the databases are now sitting on a failover cluster. And if the failover cluster loses quorum, the databases are going to be offline, regardless of whether the SQL Server databases are healthy, whether SQL Server instance is healthy. it doesn't matter. The minute that failover cluster loses quorum, the databases will go offline. And again, this is one of those setting and managing expectations, because if they're still doing what they have been doing as part of their operational processes, then they'll just assume, okay, it is going to work the way it has worked ever since. We didn't change anything. And setting and managing expectations will allow you to not just deal with the black box, but also to set the expectations when something like this happens. Like, for instance, again, the database went offline. You know, because you communicated with the other teams, you know that they're doing maintenance. You know it's a Windows or failover cluster type maintenance. You know that you don't have any access at all to both the operating system as well as the failover cluster, or on the VMs themselves. You can easily communicate that with the stakeholders, telling them, look, it's not that I'm pushing the responsibility to different teams, but unfortunately, I really don't have access. But this is what is communicated. And so we're setting the expectation that it is going to take this much longer when it comes to maintenance. And it is these simple things, right? Understanding the black box. You still don't have access, but you know what to expect because you understand what the black box is doing. Communicating with the teams responsible for those black boxes. You understand and you communicate with those teams so that you have this open flow of communication between what they're doing and how it impacts you, between what you're doing and how it impacts them. I remember one case of a client of mine where all of a sudden their availability groups can no longer talk to each other, meaning the replicas can no longer talk to each other. And they were trying to troubleshoot all these, not realizing that the network team rolled out an emergency firewall rule. This was something that they needed to do to mitigate a security exploit, but they did not tell, right? They did not tell DBAs. And now the DBAs are stuck there trying to figure things out. They're trying to troubleshoot a lot of these things, not realizing, oops, I really have nothing to do with this. It's the network guy. They did this. They did not communicate it to us, and now we have to suffer trying to troubleshoot and figure out what went wrong when they could have just told us. And because the network team does not understand the impact of what they did to the availability group, it ended up, becoming a 2-day exercise trying to figure out what went wrong, troubleshooting a lot of issues, which could have been prevented had both teams understood the black box, communicated with the other teams, and set the expectations, setting and managing expectations. Now, here's the kicker, right? Here's the kicker. I did say 4 things. 4 things on how to deal with a black box when you don't have access. None of those 3 things would work if you don't have this one thing. And it's interesting because this is something that we do both consciously and unconsciously, yet we do it anyway. The 4th thing is to trust the other teams. Trust is very, very important. And you know how it is when you talk to the SAN administrators or you talk to the VM admins, and it's not a question that you're asking, but rather an accusation. Hey, you guys did maintenance, you didn't tell us. And they would feel that. They will feel that we don't trust them. They would feel that we do not value their work. And because of that, they would reciprocate in a way where they would also not trust us. I remember working with a client a couple of years ago where the sysadmin teams are the sysadmin team, the members of which they're being looked down on. People call them dinosaurs. People would treat them as, you guys are so old that you don't even bother learning these new technologies. And everybody who would come and approach the sysadmins, that team, they were already cautious about how to interact with the other people. And again, this is something that we do both consciously and subconsciously. None of the three things that I've mentioned, understanding the black box, communicating with the team, and setting the expectations, none of those would work if you don't trust the other people, if you don't trust the teams that are managing these black boxes. Mainly because it is a trust that makes everything work. All right. If your SQL Server databases are running on failover cluster, you have to trust that your failover cluster admins know what they're doing. And I've heard it so many times. We're trying to tell the failover cluster admins what they need to do, and they don't listen to us. Now we're stuck in this mess, and we have to deal with this outages. Here's the thing. Assume that everybody is doing their best given the availability of their resources, given their limited understanding, given the capabilities and their skills and the experience they have, right? The thing that I usually tell other people, like, you don't expect a 5-year-old to know how to pay their taxes. The kid, 5-year-old, will only do what they think is right for them. And so even when I get called in to fix a configuration issue with a failover cluster, I don't blame the person who did the setup and configuration. I don't blame the consultant, the sysadmin, because they only did what they thought was right given the resources, circumstances, and the experiences that they had. And so I have to trust the person that he did what he thought was best, given the limited understanding, limited resources, and limited experience that they have. And in the same way, when you're interacting with the other team members, assume that they are doing the best they can. It's just that, well, they don't understand the black box the way you do, or both of you don't understand that what they're doing is impacting what you're doing, and vice versa, right? Maybe they don't know how to communicate properly because they're all introverts and we'd rather send emails and instant messages rather than ask questions directly. Maybe they don't know how to set expectations and manage those expectations. And that is why sometimes they feel they're being judged. They feel like they're being accused of not doing their best. Trust is the thing that glues all of these together. So if you want to deal with the black box, specifically your SQL Server HA solutions that are sitting on black boxes, remember these 4 things. Number 1, understand the black box. You don't need to be a subject matter expert. You just need to understand how it works. Then you know how to respond to it. Number 2, communicate with the other teams that are responsible for managing those black boxes. 3, set the right expectations. You set the expectation, you manage the expectation. And the most important of all, trust the team. Trust that they're doing the best they can, given the minimum or given the limited amount of skills, resources, information, and experience that they have, and they're doing the best that they can. And if you're stuck in a situation where, yeah, you are given the responsibility to manage a black box, you don't have the permissions, and you feel like, I don't think I'm qualified enough to manage a high availability solution, here's what I have for you. I've set aside some time within the next 48 hours, and in my calendar, use that link, by the way, on the screen. I've set aside some time to talk to you and speak to you about what challenges you are experiencing when you're either managing an always on availability or failover cluster instance, or maybe implementing it. Maybe you're confused. There's so many things that you need to consider. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. This would direct you to my public calendar where you can choose a calendar or time slot that works for you. Schedule a call and let's have a conversation. And I can guarantee it's going to be the best 45 minutes to an hour worth of conversation you've ever had to clear out a lot of the confusions you have when you're implementing a SQL Server high availability and or a disaster recovery solution. All right. That's about it for this week's episode. Tune in again next week for another topic of conversation. And if this has proved valuable to you, watch the recording immediately after this live stream is over. The recording will be made available. Watch it as many times as you want. Take as much notes, and it will definitely help you deal with whatever black box you need to deal with running your SQL Server databases on a high availability platform, right? Enjoy the rest of your weekend. I am going to see you again next week. Goodbye.